Okay, sound check. Can y'all hear me in the back? Everybody good? Whoop, good. Okay. Again, I'm still Jim Helis. I still chair Dinas. Welcome back from a long weekend. I know a lot of time was put into papers for some of you this weekend. But you also know it's kind of still early in the school year because on a Monday after a 4-day weekend, the first folks started trickling in here at 8:15, so that's good. Everybody's still in the game. Okay, we're going to talk this morning for about 30 minutes and talk about Carl von Clausewitz and on war. And so today, we're talking about who is Clausewitz, who's the man, what was his life, what were his experiences, what shaped his thoughts as he put together this work on war. Then talk about a little bit about actually how he constructed it and wrote it, how he put it together. I think we all know that it is an incomplete work. He never finished it. So what we have is editing and was edited after his death. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about some of the key ideas to kick around over the next couple of days as we look at Clausewitz. Now, why do we study Clausewitz and give particular attention to him? One reason, if you look straight in joint doctrine, it says we are a Clausewitzian force. So what does that mean to us? How has Clausewitz shaped American strategic and military thought? Another is he is considered, like Thucydides, one of the classics. And the work addresses everything from tactics to operations to the strategic level. Now, some of it is very contemporaneous to his time, but there are some lasting lessons from it that endure, that still apply today, even in a post-9/11 era where we're moving away from state-state conflict and looking more at non-state actors and intrastate conflict. That there are still principles in Clausewitz that apply today to our business. So, who is Clausewitz? Prussian, born 1780 in Berg. His father had been a lieutenant under Frederick the Great. Following the wars and demobilization, became a mid-level official for the Internal Revenue Service. His dad was a tax collector, basically. He entered service at age 12 in 1792 in the infantry. Saw his first campaigning in 1793 in the Rhineland campaign when the Prussians were fighting in the wars against revolutionary France. So he is off to war at a very, very young and very early age. And again, first campaigning, picture this, a subaltern essentially at age 13, who then continues to serve in the military until his death in 1831. Now, after the Rhineland campaign, the regiment returns to garrison, and at that point, Clausewitz begins a life of both formal and, more importantly, self-development and self-education. He was a true model of an autodidact, a true model of a lifelong learner. The commander of the regiment and the royal patrons of the regiment believed in education, the importance of education. The regiment actually ran classes for children of the nearby communities. Clausewitz, as a young officer, almost certainly taught those classes. The officers also engaged in formal classes themselves. They had access to libraries, to the arts, to opera, to music, and they were expected to undertake what today we will call a broad liberal education, which encompassed the arts, the sciences, philosophy, history, and so on. And so he is a self-learner from a very early age. In 1801, he is appointed to the first academy of the new Kriegsacademy, the War Academy established in Berlin. It's a 3-year program. He graduates in 1804 as number 1 in his class. So showing at a very early age the intellect and the thinking skills to think about war across the spectrum from the tactical to the strategic levels. While he's at the Kriegsacademy, he begins what is also a lifelong effort of writing and publication. And he starts to write about military theory at the time. And he's critical of it because he believes that it is too linear. It is too narrowly focused. And this idea of military theory will stay with him all of his life, and it will culminate in his magnum opus on war. After graduation from the Kriegsacademy, he is assigned as an adjutant to a grenadier battalion that is commanded by a prince. In 1806, during the Jena campaign, the battalion is, when Napoleon's army essentially destroys the Prussian army in a matter of hours. As the Prussian army retreats, Clausewitz's battalion is left as part of the rear guard force. They essentially fight until surrounded and out of ammunition and are forced to surrender. The prince, because he's royalty, is taken prisoner of war along with his adjutant Clausewitz, and they're taken to France. They're not paroled. They're not really held as prisoners of war, but in the spirit of the times, they're held essentially as not quite hostages until the peace agreement is formally signed between France and Prussia. Now, while in France, he's not interred or under arrest. He is allowed some freedom of movement and is allowed to travel. And Clausewitz gets to observe firsthand, not just what he has read, but firsthand, the revolutionary changes wrought in France. And he's able to see the administrative, the economic, the political, the psychological, the military mobilization of the French state. Essentially, he's able to see a modern state totally mobilized for war. When he is paroled finally in 1808 and returns to Prussia, he becomes part of a small group of officers who begin working on reforms within the Prussian military and within the Prussian state. Now, Prussia is trying to cope with and figure out how was Prussia, with this great long military history, defeated by Napoleon and this, what they believe to be revolutionary rabble. And Clausewitz can come back and say, that's not what it is. What we've seen is a modern state, and if we're going to continue to compete in the world, we in Prussia have to reform. In this period, 1808 to 1812, Clausewitz works on everything from equipment, he can understand defense enterprise management, doctrine, training, and again, thinking about strategy, national strategy, and the strategic level of war. He is operating completely across the spectrum working for senior officers. Now note, he's about 28, 29 years old at this time. I think at that time, most of us at 28 or 29 were trying to cope with how to be successful company battery troop commanders. He's coping with national level issues. So again, a precociousness above his years. He has some in the Prussian hierarchy who are mistrustful of him, believe that he may be dangerous because he may be importing revolutionary ideas from France. He may have drank some of the Kool-Aid. At the same time, he has important patrons, and he's assigned as the military tutor to the crown prince. Part of bringing up the prince is preparing him to be king. Clausewitz is assigned the responsibility for preparing the future king to deal with his role as commander-in-chief in military matters. 1812, he breaks with the Prussian state. The Prussians, under pressure from Napoleon, agreed to allow Napoleon to use Prussia as a base of operations for the upcoming campaign against Russia and provided a corps for the Grand Armée. Now remember, when Napoleon goes into Russia, it is not a French army, it is a true multinational army with units from throughout the conquered empire that France is building in Europe. He breaks with the Prussian state. He actually wrote a short paper saying, we did not have to succumb to political pressure. We could have taken to the hills and, in effect, fought what today we would call a guerrilla war or an insurgency as a way of opposing the French. But we sacrificed our national honor. He couldn't live with it, so he, in effect, defects to the Russian side, offers his services to the Tsar. His services are accepted. He comes into the Russian army. His role is going to be limited in the Russian war. Why might that be? Doesn't speak Russian. Yeah, it's kind of limits your role in the Russian force. But he is able to act as an advisor. He observes the great battles at Borodino. He writes a good account of the French crossing of the Berezina River in the winter during the retreat. So he documents the war, some key episodes of the war. Key role he played was in negotiating the defection or the counter-defection, if you will, of that Prussian corps. He convinces the Prussian corps commander to break off from the Grand Armée, to join the Russian army, again, as Napoleon is engaged in a retreat. After this, he is appointed as the chief, Clausewitz is appointed chief of staff of what was called the Russian-German Legion, continues to fight in the campaign against Napoleon, eventually returns to service in the Prussian army in 1814. He is again assigned as a corps chief of staff in the 1815 campaign and participates in the 1815 campaign, not at the Battle of Waterloo, but in some of the battles before that. After the fall of Napoleon, the establishment of peace, he returns to Prussia, essentially to garrison duties. And again, you have this officer who is enormously talented, has written well, has thought well, has tremendous combat experience from the tactical level, again, in his teenage years, all the way up to serving as a corps chief of staff. Enormously talented. On the other hand, there's this mistrust. What did he pick up from France? He has defected to Russia, so what do you do with him? Now, you also have to remember he is connected at court because he is married during his tour in Berlin. Prior to the Napoleonic Wars, his wife is well connected in court as well. you promote him and you kick him upstairs. He's promoted to Major General, and he's assigned as director of the Kriegsacademy, from which he graduated #1 in his class. Now, that may sound like an impressive title. Okay, Commandant of the Army War College, has quite a bit of reign over the curriculum, the faculty, and what goes on here, and so on. At the Kriegsacademy, his position was essentially administrative. He had no say in the curriculum. He didn't have any influence over faculty. He had almost no contact with students. In fact, the Prussian leadership of the mid-19th century, who led the wars of German unification, went through the Kriegsacademy at this time, kind of knew he was there, but he was some bureaucrat who was in some back office someplace. What he is doing, he said, his dirty duties did not challenge him either intellectually or time-wise. And so what does he choose to do with his time? He decides to put it into creating, again, what is his magnum opus on war, and writing this book, this treatise on the nature of war. Now, this is what he wrote in kind of a memorandum to himself when he set out to write on war. Does this remind you of anybody we looked at earlier? Thucydides. I'm trying to write a work for the ages. I'm not trying to write something that's just going to be on the bestseller list or be a short-term hit, but I'm trying to write an enduring, long-term work on the art, on the nature of war. And that's the note he writes to himself in 1818. Now, he starts off with, okay, where do we stand with military theory today? What's the state of military theory as we look at it in the immediate post-Napoleonic era? And these are the kinds of things that get you in trouble with your bosses when you write these. And again, some of the writers, most of the theory then was being written, a lot of it by general officers, by senior officers, not by relatively younger or junior officers, but didn't believe much in what had already been written. And his main criticism was that the theory of war to that time had been very fixed, had been very quantitative. It focused on lines of operation, distance of marches, locations and distances of supply bases, the role of geography. For those who are trying to scribble notes, this is going to be up on the portal. It's also on the P drive, so the slides will be are available right now. But the role of geography, so he is looking at, they said, you're looking at purely quantitative side of war. And maneuvering, simply if you maneuver at the right angles, you can get to a position where you maneuver opponent and you win. He obviously had different thoughts on it. Now, how did he go to set about writing the work? Essentially, it was, I'm going to sit down and write everything I know about war and all the thoughts I've had over this lifetime. Again, at this point, we're talking 25, 26 years of service when he starts this work. Everything I know about war, and then I'm going to start to organize it. And the audience I'm writing for are professionals. Okay, this is not a work for amateurs, but I'm assuming that you know something about it. But again, he starts out, tries to write everything he knows, and then starts to work on it and revise it. And the revisions become a lifelong effort. Now, 9 years later, again, he writes a couple of notes to himself, and hopefully you will not see this on any of your papers or on any of your SRPs, but this is his own judgment of his work after 9 years. So again, hopefully none of you will ever see that on your papers this year. But if you do, you could be writing the next on war, so don't feel badly about it. He was very discouraged with the work, and he said, I've got a lot of work to do on it, and here's what I need to get to clean this up. First, he needed to clarify what he felt were the two types of war, and clarify those definitions. One type of war was that which was designed to conquer your enemy, to make your enemy militarily and hence diplomatically and politically impotent. Completely disarm him, put your adversary at your mercy. Now he wrote, now this war, he never used the term total war, but he said, but this form of war can drift into what he called absolute or ideal war, which is pure violence, pure and absolute and unchecked violence, that he believed in the real world would be mitigated by policy issues, but you could drift towards that absolute war. The second type of war he looked at was what he defined as limited war. And he said, in limited wars, they tend to be fought on the periphery, they tend to be fought at the frontier, and they're designed to gain territory or some object to be used as a bargaining chip in diplomatic relationships with your adversary. So again, he said, I need to clarify between wars of conquest and limited wars. Second point he needed to clarify, and this is one of the ones that we always talk about when we talk about Clausewitz. War is nothing but the continuation of policy by other means. Wars are fought to achieve aims of policy, to achieve political purposes. And he will hammer this theme over and over and over again through his works. And he said, I need to make that clearer, and I need to weave that theme throughout the books. And in a final note, kind of an editing note as part of this, he said, I need to complete Book 8. He wrote that he thought that Book 8 would be the place where all of the ideas, all of the key issues would come together. And he felt at the time, I said, although it's a formless mass, Book 1 is actually in pretty good condition right now. I need to get Book 8, which will kind of sum up and tie the ideas together, and then I need to double back and go through it and get everything aligned and consistent through it. So his plan, again, was Books 1 and 8, essentially from what we can pick up as bookends to the great work, and that's what he needed to go to work on. So that's what he wrote of himself in 1827. He goes on to work on it for 3 more years. At the end of the 3 years in 1830, he is recalled from the War Academy after 12 years there as the president, mostly working on this text on war. He is recalled, and remember, he's been an infantryman all his life. He's brought back to service in the Field Artillery Directorate. He's brought back in as a gunner, and he's put in the Inspector Generalship. So he has to throw himself into learning the technical aspects of artillery, with engineers and cavalry, the more technical branches of the time. He is then reassigned as the Chief of Staff under Gneisenau in the east. There's unrest in Poland. They're trying to develop a cordon sanitaire to prevent, again, revolutionary ideas from trickling into Prussia. Concurrently, a cholera epidemic breaks out in Poland, so it's not only a cordon against ideas, but it becomes a cordon against the epidemic, against a pandemic disease. Unfortunately for Clausewitz, they fail to contain the epidemic. He contracts cholera, dies in November of 1831. After his death, how does the work get published? Now again, this is what he wrote about himself in 1827. So although he saw it as a formless mass, he said, there are good ideas in there. There are things that the professional can pick up and work with in what I've worked with so far. So he was not completely unhappy with the work. Now how does it get published? I heard somebody say it. Countess von Brühl, his wife. She writes in the introduction that she writes to the book, it's very contemporaneous, it's very self-deprecating. You can see something about the role of women in 19th century society and in Prussian society. Far be it from me to say that I'm the editor of this work. Far be it from me to be the one to try to put this great work forward, but I felt it needed to be out. Now she also, it says in there, I told him several times he needed to go ahead and get this published. He told me that I will never be published in my lifetime. It's going to take forever. And she said that really made me unhappy. I was disappointed that he would say that, but it actually came to be true. So, you can read between the lines. He wasn't going to get it out there. I'm going to get it out there for him because there are good ideas in it. All of the material was boxed. It was labeled. So she, with a couple of other officers, went through, put it together. And although at one point she says, I'm not the editor of this, there's some pretty clear that she did participate in the editing. How do you sort the papers out? They found notes for Book 1, and they felt, Book 1, we had his makeup notes for Book 1 were completed, so that kind of leads to think maybe that Book 8 was in pretty good shape if you follow his plan. But anyway, she puts it together, and it gets published in 1832. Okay, so what influence does it have? First off, it is not widely read because it's written in German, and German was not the most accessible language in the early to mid-19th century. French was the language of most intellectuals, most scholarship, most diplomacy. I have not read it in the original. A couple of years ago, one of our German international fellows said he actually found it easier to read and understand in English than he did in his own native German. And last year's IF kind of nodded and confirmed, said, yeah, it is hard to wade through in the original. So it was not an accessible work. But von Moltke the Elder, who was chief of the German General Staff for literally generations, through the wars of German unification and through the Bismarckian era, was known to have read it and said it was one of the most influential works that he had read in his life. So if the book is on the chief's bookshelf, who else is reading it? Yeah, pretty much everybody, okay? So it is fairly widely read within the Prussian, later German army in the 19th century. The French and English, there are French and English translations. The first English translation is 1874. In the UK, it goes absolutely nowhere. It is retranslated, a better translation about 1904. The British are looking at it, it appears, not so much to try to adopt his ideas, but to see in the mind of the Germans and how the Germans thought about war, because they saw the coming Anglo-German war, they saw greater possibilities, and part of it was figuring we need to understand what they think, and they always talk about this book on war. So there's the first English translation. Japan is an interesting case. After the Russo-Japanese War, senior officer in the German General Staff sends a congratulatory letter to the Japanese army commander and offers him, if you're interested, we can provide you some copies of this great treatise on war by Clausewitz. The reply back is, well, thank you very much, but we already have copies. We've translated them into Japanese, and it did do some influence on my thinking as we designed the campaigns. Now, how much, we're not sure, but it was used. It probably came to the Japanese through some of the retired Prussian officers that they brought to Japan to help them develop, build, and train their army in the years prior to the Russo-Japanese War. Finally, the USA, American influence. Don't see much influence of Clausewitz until after World War II. We don't see any evidence that it was really studied in the interwar years in the command and staff of the war colleges. The first useful translation available in the U.S. was about 1942, but it was an incomplete. Clausewitz does not gain traction in the U.S. until the Cold War. When scholars of the war, particularly Bernard Brody, who we'll read later in the course, pick up and start to look at Clausewitz as something that we can use to think about some of the developments that have occurred during the Cold War. And what were the main military developments that we saw during the Cold War? It was number one, the clear one. Nuclear weapons. Okay, Clausewitz had said you can get to this absolute war that is without reason, that is pure, unchecked, and uncontrolled violence. Well, it was difficult to get to in his time and difficult to get to even in World War II because of the means available. With nuclear weapons married to long-range bombers and later to intercontinental ballistic missiles, states could engage in this complete, ideal, absolute, totally destructive war in a matter of minutes. And so that gets Brody and others to think about what does Clausewitz say about the nature of war, because we've reached this point in warfare. The other characteristic we saw in the Cold War was limited wars. Okay, and again, Clausewitz talked about the two kinds of war, one being limited war, and limited war, wars being fought for political objectives, for policy objectives, okay, in part because of the threat of nuclear war, that you couldn't let a major interstate war get to this point where you got to the absolute and unchecked war. And so you see Clausewitz influencing strategic thought through the 50s, 60s, into the 70s. And again, in the 70s is when you begin to see it adopted in the American professional military education system. So that's kind of a quick run-through on the history of the influence of Clausewitz. Now, what are some of his key ideas? Some things to think about over the next couple of days. And again, we'll touch on Clausewitz again when we get down towards Gettysburg Staff Ride. Okay, what's the role of theory to Clausewitz? Okay, he talks about war. There's so many things. War is such a complex phenomenon. There are so many things going on in it. The one thing what theory does is it allows you to peel those concepts apart and examine the constituent parts of war. The second was, with his theory, he wanted to examine all aspects of war. And again, critical inquiry, we call it critical thinking. But a critical thinking exercise about this central phenomenon called war. Finally, to educate the mind of the future commander. Okay, he said you don't want to enter into a war and be starting with everything anew. You want to have everything lined up and, in effect, internalized ideas and understanding of the concepts and nature of war before you embark on a war. So it's part of the education and the development of the mind of the commander. Now, at the same passage, he cautions, theory is not something you take to the battlefield. Just as you would not take your teacher with you when you leave the classroom and go out to work, you don't take theory with you by the hand and take it out to the battlefield. It is an educational tool to prepare the commander, to prepare leaders for war. So to study theory. Now, what are some of the key ideas he brings in? Okay, clearly war is an instrument of policy. That's woven throughout his works, and probably the one thing that he would foot stomp on is that wars are fought for reasons of policy, for political ends. He saw battle as the decisive means in war. Okay, 18th century warfare, a lot of it was about maneuver. Ideally, you want to maneuver your opponent to the point where you win. Clausewitz believed it's about battle. War is an act of force, and he did not mean economic force or diplomatic. When he said force, he meant the use of military force to compel your adversary to do what you want him to do. That it was an act of force. Now, you could, by maneuver, force the adversary to surrender. He would come to a rational calculus of, yep, I'm beaten and surrender without going through the fighting. But he believed it's about fighting. The whole purpose of training, arming, and equipping a soldier is to put him at the right time and right place on the battlefield, was one of his dicta. That's the only reason it exists. You don't maneuver for the sake of maneuver. You maneuver to get to a position of advantage so you can defeat the enemy in battle. He really pushed the idea of battle as decisive means in war. He introduced fog and friction. Okay, it's not about lines on a map. It's not about geography. Yes, that matters. Yes, you got to know where the rivers and the mountains are. But fog and friction are inevitable. Friction, the many things that can go wrong, where chance and probability come into play. The wagon wheel that falls off, the unit that gets lost, the order that gets dropped and doesn't get handed to the commander in time, the change in weather, things that you cannot control as a commander. And fog, the ambiguity, the uncertainty, the lack of information. He's very critical of intelligence. You wonder what kind of G2, J2 support he received as a chief of staff based on his comments on intelligence. But there's friction and fog are inevitable. And the good commander understands that, accepts it, and the ones who can lubricate friction and are resilient and can be flexible in the face of friction, and the ones that can have the will to see through the fog, to grab what they think is that dim light and pursue it, are the ones who are going to be successful. He talks about the dominance of psychological forces and effects and in interaction. War is not simply lines on a map and moving block charts. Your adversary is a living, thinking being just like you. He is subject to psychological forces and pressures, and it's interaction. It's a wrestling match. Today, the phrase we talk about, the enemy has a vote. The enemy gets a say. So you can design it on a map, but understand that this is an interaction and that, with an adversary, and that psychological forces, as much as physical forces, play into that interaction. Okay, final key thought from Clausewitz. We'll wrap it up. The war is the paradoxical trinity. Now, often we'll hear folks say Clausewitz said the trinity was the people, the government, and the army. That wasn't the trinity as he laid it out. He said there are connections between the people, the government, the army, and the forces in the trinity, but that war was a paradoxical trinity. Again, primordial violence, hatred, and enmity. He said, now that is normally resonant in the people, and you see it in the people, and that has to be present before you actually undertake a war. There has to be some of this in being within the population. And this primordial violence, if left unchecked, takes you to absolute senseless war that is not connected to policy or reason. Chance and probability. Again, he's talking about friction in the creative mind, seeing through the fog. And finally, war as an element of policy that is subordinate to policy and is hence reason. So you have this triangle of reason and hatred and violence carried out in an atmosphere, in an environment, in a milieu that's characterized by friction and by fog. And those three have to be somehow kept, maybe not in balance, but kept in relationship. And the task he set for himself, how do you account for those three forces that are paradoxical but always in play in war? Okay, those are some quick opening thoughts on Clausewitz. It's informed discussion, things to think about. Again, we'll look at it for the next couple of days. He'll come up again in other lessons. We'll pick up his lessons on generalship and leadership when we get to the Gettysburg Staff Ride. but a key thinker. I'll admit my bias. I'm a Clausewitzian, like doctrine. Like doctrine, I would step here and say I'm a Clausewitzian. Complicated work. Also, like Sun Tzu, it gets bumper stickered. It has to be understood. First, it's an incomplete work. Like Sun Tzu, it's an edited work. But there are ideas and themes in there that we need to pick up on and hold to that apply even today. Okay, Q&A will be upstairs in seminar room. Welcome back from the weekend. Thanks very much. And FIs, you've got it.